Hello and welcome back to the Science of Sports series on talent identification and management. Today's part 2, which I know I promised you a week or so ago, but the usual scandal, doping, match fixing has come up as well as normal work. So I had to delay it a little bit, but I'm here today to bring you the second part, and it follows on from what I spoke about last time, which was the fundamental definition of talent ID. And today is more about the inefficiencies. It just introduces you to the concept that I'm sure you're aware of, which is that the younger we try and make the prediction about who's got talent and ability for the future, the less likely we are to be correct. And I've got an example to show you, as well as some research which shows you how large that inefficiency is and when it occurs, and then explain a little bit about the drivers. And that's all a lead-in to discussing how you might actually capitalize on some of those inefficiencies to your own advantage, and also how you might reduce them, of course, in your own domain, whether you're a coach, a teacher, a parent, high performance manager, or even an athlete. So I'm going to get straight to it, otherwise it gets too lengthy. So this is part 2, acceptable inefficiencies. So you might recall last time we looked at the definition of talent ID, and I spoke of it being a budgeting decision which you would have to make, whether you're a coach, a parent, an athlete, or the manager of a high performance system, in order to decide how best you can allocate your resources to a given group of players. So I spoke about how you might have 300 players, but you can only support 30 of them. And Talent ID was the decision and the tools that allowed you to choose which of those 10% you were going to invest in. So if we keep the analogy going to business, you might think of it as a decision about whose shares to invest in. And I want to start this installment by talking a little bit about the fundamental challenge that's faced by the person making the selection. And to do that, I just want to show you a picture here. This is a school in Cape Town where a under-13 rugby match was taking place. And the fellow in the middle here is the adult referee, and on his left is the captain of one of the teams, 13 years old, and the opponent captain, 13 years old. Now, rugby, for those of you who don't know, is a sport much like American football, where the bigger you are, the faster you are, the stronger you are, the more likely you are to be successful. It's not to say that small people can't succeed, but the bigger you are, the more chance there is. So if you had $100,000, and that was your budget, and you had to choose one of these two players, either the left or the right, the question is, whose shares would you buy? Now, I know what I would do. I would take what seems to be the less risky proposition and invest in the bigger guy. But obviously the problem is they're 13 years old, so you don't know what that person is going to look like at the age of 22. So if it's a short-term investment, then this investment might be better, whereas the long-term investment is impossible to make, given that you do not know how genetics, physiology, training, psychology, and social environments are going to play out between these two players. It's quite possible that this player here is one day going to be bigger, faster, stronger, and smarter, and maybe a little bit more courageous because of what he went through at the age of 13 than this player here. But the point is that in the real world, this pot of gold, which is not infinite, has to be allocated, and we make the decision based on what we can see, not on what we know for the future. And what has resulted then, and I'm sure you can relate to this no matter where in the world you are, is that we've got this race to the bottom where the challenge is now on to find the players younger and younger and younger. Why is that? Well, there's competition, because the longer we wait to identify future sports stars, the more likely opposition teams are going to be to find them. The more expensive they become. And that's the equivalent of buying a share of a startup company as opposed to buying a share of an established multi-billion-dollar company. And then there's the opportunity cost. We know that if we don't pick a player and someone else does, and that player happens to become Lionel Messi or Roger Federer, then we've lost out an enormous opportunity. And finally, it's just the fear. We're so uncertain about waiting for the future that we make commitments very early, and the result is that we make bad commitments, but we do the best we can with what we've got at the moment. The problem is that it's inefficient and most likely to actually be a waste of money than it is beneficial. Now, my perception on this, looking at the entire system, is that there's too much inertia to change it. Schools are already looking for 7-8-year-olds so that they can play for them when they're in high school. Sports teams are looking for young kids because it's cheaper, and they're not going to change their behavior. There's just too much inertia there. And so my feeling is that the solution would be to turn the inefficiencies into opportunities. And that's something that as I go through this presentation, I'll try and offer you a few ideas of how that could happen. So when we talk about inefficiency, there's no such thing, obviously, as a perfectly efficient talent ID and development system. If there was, then, and if I knew it, I would quit this and become a billionaire, because I would be able to spot the next Novak Djokovic or the next Lionel Messi at the age of 12. I'd be living in mansions all around the world. So we accept that there's going to be some inefficiency. The problem is, at what point does that inefficiency become the hemorrhaging of talent, and where do we draw the line? So there has to be some acceptable standard. Now, to just show you an example of this, I want to go to South African rugby, which, as I said, is a sport that rewards size and strength and power. And in South Africa, we've got 3 competitions at the age grade level. There's an under-13 competition where the best players from each district or province or region, if you want to call them that, is chosen to represent their region in a national tournament. Then there's an under-16 tournament. Obviously, the same players could go to 3 years later. And it's followed by an under-18 tournament, which is the last year before players leave school. So we can ask the question, what percentage of the players who represent their territories or regions at the age of 13 will ultimately make it through the pathway and appear in the system at the age of 18? Because that will give us an idea of how efficient or inefficient the system is. So in 2005, at the under-13 tournament, there were 349 under-13 players. And we know from research done by Justin Durant at the University of Cape Town that by under 18, which would be 5 years later, only 84 of those same players had emerged at the other end of the pipeline. So that's 1 in 4, roughly, 24%. What's interesting, then, is that 76% of those players have disappeared somewhere between 13 and 18 years old. But when we look at the under-16 competition, we can see that the disappearance has already happened. So 349 has become 110 within the first 3 years, and then 110 becomes 84 over the course of the next 2 years. And so what it means is that of those 265, 239, which is by far the majority, are lost between the ages of 13 and 16. And then from this point onwards, only 26 are lost. And so what does that tell us? Well, it tells us a number of things. First of all, 1 in 4 is actually pretty good. If you could take 100 people at the age of 13 and be certain that 25 or whatever would make it to 18, that's not bad going. Obviously, the drop-off from here into professional is by far the largest, because there's limited professional places. But the main thing this tells us is that the biggest drop-off happens between 13 and 16. And so once you've made it to 16, the probabilities of continuing are much greater. So the inefficiency exists here, and there's less of it here. And that is a result, I'm sure you can guess, of the physical developments that tend to happen at around this point or slightly before. Adolescence is the great filter. And so 13 years old, the players who are 13 here potentially are early developers whose advantage is cut away and made to disappear by 16, and that's why they disappear. And it's these players who've already achieved the physical development that will then continue in the system. So, the first flag then is, if the main purpose is maximum efficiency, then waiting as long as possible is better for you. And so when we look at these invited efficiencies, as I said, we're trying to apply this 90% filter as a result of necessity. However, we have inefficiency that is driven by the following things. Number one is our tools. We just are not that good at identifying future potential based on current observations. Secondly is our crystal ball is inadequate. Even if we had perfect tools to measure performance today, projecting forward is very difficult and inaccurate. And finally, there's reality. Life sometimes gets in the way. So as much as I want to say that the scientists and the coaches can apply tools, there are, for every one thing they can measure, there are probably 99 they can't, including things like life factors, socioeconomic, cultural issues, family issues, relationship issues. So the reality just gets in the way. And of course, all of these are tied into our environment. So this is what drives inefficiency. So I just want to give you a conceptual model for this. So we put ability or potential, if you wish, depending on your timing and how you define it as present versus future on the y-axis. And then we'll put time on the x-axis. And obviously what we want to do sometime in the future is we want to create a superstar. That's an Olympic or a world champion, a World Cup winner, Wimbledon champion, whatever your pick is. But we're starting with someone at this point here, 13, 14 years old perhaps, and maybe we've got two young athletes. And at the moment we look at them at the age of 13, there's a clear difference in the ability. This athlete looks to us, using our tools as of this moment, today, to be inferior to the red triangle. Now the question is, what causes this difference? Maybe he's a little slower, maybe he's shorter, maybe he's less powerful, less strong, less tactically aware, mature. You take your pick of things that could cause a difference in ability. But the problem is that that ability is confounded by biological age. So it's possible that two 13-year-olds are actually 2 years apart in terms of their physiological development. You know, you've seen this, precocious youngsters. I showed you a picture of rugby players a few minutes ago, that kind of thing. And the second thing is training age. And so with training age, what could very well happen is that this athlete at the age of 13 has had 3 or 4 years of training, whereas this one might have had 3 or 4 months. And of course that's going to make a difference. And so unless you can correct for that, you don't know whether this red triangle, with the same training as this green square, might have been actually inferior. And the thing you can control over time is training. And so you cannot make a projection forward unless you also acknowledge and respect what the training circumstances and histories were of two players or more players when you look at them when they're still very young. So that's an enormous difference. Then it gets even more complex, because what we're trying to do is predict or project what the person's trajectory will be moving forward. Now it's possible that the person improves linearly for a long time and then reaches a plateau and then levels off and never quite makes it to the stardom, whereas another person increases linearly and gets all the way to the top step of the podium. And that's the crystal ball that I spoke of. We just do not have a crystal ball that can make this prediction accurately. And so we're always guessing to some extent. Not completely, we're not totally blind, but we certainly don't have 20/20 vision. And so trajectory is the second big confounder. So ultimately what it makes you ask is, why would you make that prediction here? Given that the tools are imperfect, you often cannot correct for biological and training age, and your ability to predict the trajectory of the athlete is so flawed. Yet you're still investing time and money making predictions as early as possible. So the moral of the story is, don't make the pick so early. So we select too early, with imperfect tools, with long-term hopes rather than certainties, and it happens because we have to. And I don't want to trivialize that, because the environment that we live in, I spoke of the inertia, that dictates that we must make that selection very early. And the result of making it, unfortunately, are these enormous inefficiencies. And it's something we have to be mindful of, is finding the balance between doing what we have to do and doing what we should be doing. And that's the focus of the next parts of this talk. And I'm going to throw in a few questions and try and challenge some thinking as we move forward. But I think let's leave it there for today. Okay, that's it for acceptable inefficiencies. Where we are going next will be to discuss a little bit about the tense issue around dealing with the present, the past, and the future, and then showing you how that plays into the fact that our tools are actually quite imperfect, and how it leads us to most often, more often than not actually, draw incorrect conclusions. So that will be part 3, which, barring another massive meltdown in sports governance, I will try and get done by the end of this week. So do join me then. Until then, happy identifying, and be careful about those inefficiencies.